Hello, I'm Al Fry, and in the following presentation you're going to be exposed to some little-known and long-hidden truths concerning the origin of the Bible stories. And at first, this may not coincide with what you've been taught, and it may cause a little consternation. Do not be upset, however. It is not our intention to degrade the value of the Bible. And if you will continue on, I think you'll be delighted at the new and useful information that you encounter here. The Bible does contain a great deal of inspired truths, or it would not have survived this long and inspired so many to a better set of ethics. The Bible was assembled by humans, however, and it's not reasonable to assume this was done in perfection. Humans are not perfect. And in this work, you'll be exposed to many new concepts that can widen your perspectives and help you go past the usual limitations of fundamentalism. Well, the Bibles of the world all contain a great deal of truth, and truth consists of doctrines of both free choice and domination mixed together. It is you who must decide which set of values you must live by. The values of a vengeful, eye for an eye philosophy, or the values of a golden rule and a grant each other choice philosophy. Since the Garden of Eden, we've all had choice, and it can be your choice to continue on toward more understanding and awareness at this point. Well, to understand where the ancients got many of their myths, it's important to have a little background in what constitutes matter and where our intelligence came from. At the heart of all material things, we have a non-physical, non-material atom structure, which holds this material atom structure together in the material form that we have. And in the case of life forms, we have a spiritual prototype residing in the seed or egg. Well, this non-material atom structure carries itself over in the egg, and the species knowledge is accumulated and kept in this egg knowledge assembly. In all animal forms, this knowledge is in perfection. The animal carries a perfect instinct knowledge to function in its particular environment, and they cannot function like other animals or humans, as in this picture. In the case of we humans, or species Homo sapien, there's a problem. Now, thousands of years ago, our species was contaminated with an intelligence outside of our species. And ever since this time, we've lived in chaos and confusion. Our species' instincts have been continually overridden with a new and imperfect mind component. Now, this vacillating mind input has created constant uncertainty and a very slow attrition of knowledge through painful trial and error. Well, in the egg or seed knowledge of Earth, there lies a spiritual backing of intelligence. And as long as this intelligence puts out the energy to the seeds, they can reproduce their species and can be considered life. Since the life is the most ancient interpretation, meaning that which can reproduce or sustain itself. Well, since all seeds carry the genetic patterns or plans of the species, there is no moral or rational reason back of the life form, only the various energy ties with a creator or universe, the sun-giving radiations and the joy energies from the creator. Well, unfortunately, the joy frequencies of humans got cut off thousands of years ago. And while most animals are full of affection and joy, Few humans ever even feel this wavelength. Any dog or cat you give a little affection will demonstrate a complete freedom from distrust and negativity. They'll give the affection back to you. We humans carry by total reciprocation of affection and often joy. Well, through this negative mind usage, very few humans are full emotionally. We hold back our emotions, unlike all the other animals on the planet. Have you ever seen an animal, a pet, that did not give out affection? Well, if the survival guard is down on an animal, they'll give you back affection, you can be sure. Now, the energies flowing around in our dimension are both measurable and unmeasurable. And this didn't confuse the ancients, but it's constricted the perception of materialistic scientists today. The ancients knew that all of creation is only a collection of interlinking energies, and material things only existed because of the way these energies were directed by intelligence. Well, the chaos of the Greeks and the nox of the Romans and the ner of the Egyptians and parabram of the Indians and Tao of the Chinese were simply terms for this ocean of undirected energy. And only the ancient Hebrew priests chose to ignore these concepts and build up a singular divinity to blame creation and events on. And this has caused chaos to the followers of religion. People are taught to think their Creator is responsible for the actions going on around them, and instead of realizing that events only come through natural law, that we're all responsible for our own luck and our world, the world we live in. Well, why our knowledge was perverted and twisted away from the purer and more reasonable forms of the ancient is a complex tale, and yet it's very simple in its outline. Well, the priests who perverted the truth actually told the tale themselves. Satan, or Diablos, was originally cast to earth and was the opposite of the Creator in vibration and action. This term diabolos originally meant thrown down from the spirit plane to dense matter. The ancient traditions pointed out that our species was contaminated by these early gods and lost our instinct knowledge and perfection. Later Hebrew priests boiled it all down to the Garden of Eden and our species eating of the fruit of knowledge. Legends often cover similar background in the same simplistic stories in many countries. We've all heard of Prometheus starting fire from heaven, stealing it. And this is latent in all mankind. We need to take the atoms and transmute them, as plants do from the rays of the sun. Great spiritual teachers such as Jesus Christ even showed that it could be done mentally by a human being. And even the Hebrews and their earliest traditions of creation were much more accurate than the picture that's come down through the censorship of later priests. When the original accounts of creation were written by the Hebrews, they used the term Elohim, which was plural, and it meant many gods. The Bible then was filled with the exploits and backgrounds of many lords and gods. The term Genesis was a derivative of gene, or the germ of life, and it implied generation and growth, not something out of nothing as the priests implied. In the priests' Genesis, they tell a simple story for a simple following and leave out most of the causation facts. They mention nothing of the many gods sent here from the war in heaven told by John the Revelator, or the millions of years it took for the light to be seen on earth, or for the spiritual non-material firmament atoms to form together to form the material land. Well, in most of the biblical writings of the world, the stages or energy forms between non-material and material are called water or the seas. Well, with this hidden key that we used from the ancient Egyptian and Atlantean writings, there are many deeper creation truths exposed. Troubled water, for example, indicated some of the emotional love or creative energy that was cut off. Well, the Hebrew account of the plants and life forms coming from the seeds or archetype energies within their forms is done by a singular creator. A later creation of a higher non-animal man species is done by a plural creator, the Elohim, coming itself from the term Alheim, meaning a council of gods. Well, the term Eden comes from Gan Eden, a term for Mesopotamia, and for Mesopotamia is the term for middle land, or that middle ground between darkness and light, that area that we humans are evolving ourselves in, to learn self-control and ethics, the hard way, I might add. It was not a particular physical area as much as a realm that our species was struggling and evolving in. Well, in later Genesis, we find that our planet originally was a living form herself, and her blood, or the water, did not rain down on her body, but rose to the surface and covered all plant life as a mist from the earth. The protective canopy that protected our environment was eventually lost, and the later higher Van Allen radiation belt went into place as a substitute. Now, the subject of the Earth's canopy is covered in dozens of little-known books, and even a periodical in the 1980s, and it's just too lengthy here to go into. But it is enough to remember that Earth's climate and radiation is very much different now than it once was. The climate was once much milder and much more stable, like another planet that is in our own protective system here and has her own protective canopy. You know which planet I'm speaking of? Well, the radiation from the sun at that time gave more energy, and thus greater health and longevity. And you can get a hint of this type of perfection in Genesis. In Genesis, of course, we all think of the Garden of Eden, but the gardens and vineyards mentioned in the Bible usually refer to fruitful conditions, where humans have open minds and are in tune with the Creator's laws of choice, as in this first Garden of Eden. And the wilderness and deserts are the opposite. They refer to our struggle to regain our awareness and our perfection. It's so simple. The mention of the tree of life in Genesis has its counterparts in virtually all of the ancient cultures. The Hindus, for example, have the Ashvata tree, with its roots gaining nourishment from the Creator's energy, and the 7 branches symbolizing the 7 planes or veils, the veils that we must pass through to gain our immortality or godhood status. The trees generally symbolize the Creator's life force, which is, of course, tapping energy or the Creator's energy and producing fruit. And the rivers flowing into Eden are not indicating material rivers, but the pison, or atoms, breaking forth in rapid motion to allow us to reach our perfection by using their water. Remember the rivers? Well, Gihon translates breaking forth, and Hiddekel translates rapid motion, and Euphrates translates fruitful. And most of the other cultures of the early eras had similar sacred rivers in their traditions. In some biblical references, it frequently signified the life force stream, an inner chi energy which persons could tap to work non-material into material, or work miracles if you go a step further. Well, the word Adam comes from much older cultures than the Hebrews. One Hindu work 2,000 years older than the Hebrew Bible gives an account almost identical to the Hebrew version and called the life principle Adama. Chaldean and Babylonian accounts, dating before this Hebrew version, also give similar accounts with similar Adams. The one thing the Hebrews did corrupt was the account of woman coming from the man's rib. And in a day and culture where men were masters, we can use a little logic to see how this scenario crept in. In many ancient cultures, like Egypt, the symbol of the Creator was a snake. And even our Mayas in South America had the usual 7 energies of the Creator symbolized with a multi-headed serpent. Well, originally, as we pointed out, there was no need for the life forms on this earth to delve into these questions of why and how, or even make choices of any kind. In the original paradise, all animals, including our own Homo sapiens species, were functioning in perfection, on instinct, and oblivious to all higher intelligence, thoughts, and actions. And then many of the ancient records tell us that there was a chance occurrence that upset our blissful lifestyle and brought change. Somewhere in the universe, there were beings who broke away from the Creator's laws of choice, and they were rounded up and banished to this planet Earth. Our little garden planet then became a dumping ground for high-level intelligence exiles, and our Homo sapien body became the preferred vehicle for these non-material intelligence to enter into. Virtually all of the ancient cultures tell of this invasion or event. And virtually all of the rebels, so to speak, were eventually lost in this material world by accepting their reflection as themselves. This is what the records tell you, as far as you go back. Well, tradition and most of the really ancient histories tell us that these lesser gods actually lost their knowledge of there even being a supreme creator. They came to think of themselves as the creators themselves, and the princes of this world. Well, whether accepted as fact or as an allegory, the goals are similar. Our species is now struggling along with an alien technological intelligence that is not a part of our original knowledge. By trial and error, our species is learning to blend in this knowledge with all the other former knowledges of an animal nature. Our bodies have a knowledge of agriculture, food gathering, and enjoyment. Yet the new alien mind circuits are always pushing us toward technology and ignoring our bodies and our desires. Naturally, this creates chaos and conflict until we learn enough to balance these mind-oriented thoughts and get each of our inner components an equal share of time and experiencing. With many of the body's energy seeds or prototypes now linked to a higher and alien intelligence, our species will remain in a chaotic learning condition until the lost perfection is regained. Well, this story is given in a simple allegory in the Genesis chapter of the Bible, as we mentioned, and Adam is warned that if he becomes too engrossed in pure materialism and technology, the body will self-destruct eventually and die. Well, Satan, representing the exiled and alien intelligence, is continually hooked into the human brain, and the thoughts are continually coming in with a preference toward materialistic and materialism and technology, the alien knowledges. And this alien mind action occurs when any Aborigines pure tribe interbreeds with European stock nowadays. Has for thousands of years now. Immediately, the primitive or Aborigines will forsake the tribal life and nakedness and wind up in civilization, working by the sweat of their brow, or until they learn to balance their mind components. Probably the most confusing thing about Earth is the mix-up of knowledges and intelligences here, in this schoolroom of life, so to speak. There's souls from all over the universe that evidently wind up here. And this planet is one of the most unique spheres of learning anywhere in this universe. Now, identities from all sectors apparently come here to expand their learning and self-control. And as Eliphas Levi, the great mystic, once said, the angels aspire to become men, for the perfect man, the man-God, is above even angels. We've passed through the test of fire on this planet. It's the Greek Pandora's box of chaotic experiences here that leads to our learning experience and eventual balance on this material plane. Thorns and thistles in a land outside of Eden is the way the Bible puts it. And as the gods of the non-material world descended into this material world of carbon-based atoms, the laws of matter forced them into becoming positive and negative, or male and female. And thus the regeneration female half is given responsibility for eating of the fruit of knowledge. Well, the fruit, of course, is only symbolic of the condition which arises from the gods interbreeding the animal-man species. It's a condition which corrupted the perfect animal brain circuits and caused a bypassing of the automatic instinct circuits, as we pointed out before. Now, in the original Hebrew writings, the tree of life bore 12 manners of fruit, which signified the 12 channels of spiritual energies in the body. Now, the new mind actions were unacquainted with many of the body functions, and even today, thousands of years later, most persons can't close down their alien mind circuits long enough to listen to the instinct knowledge of the body. A good example is in the sensation of junk food and ice cream and such. It's usually flashing in our memory patterns continually and influencing us beyond any natural hunger and cravings that we have from the body. Well, as we're going to repeatedly point out here, the so-called fall from perfection was when an animal man no longer had their animal perfection or instinct and had a chance to regain perfection and even gain immortality by simply learning to balance the new borrowed mind circuits of the cast-down gods. 'Twas necessary, though, that we learn self-control and ethics, and to grant each other persons choice before we could graduate from our schooling and be allowed into or back into the universe again. Well, at present, as you can probably see, the majority of persons have failed miserably in this quest toward a second, higher perfection. We've had non-ending war, and when our civilizations do regain higher-level technology, we poison ourselves and our planets with radiation and electronic pollution and goodness knows what all. Well, we remove billions of tons of oil and coal for profits and totally squelching any use of free energy. And we, in short, today's cycle ends is coming, and we still have total chaos. We're still not able to govern ourselves and follow the golden rule that our so-called religions, laid down and gave us. Well, the Cain and Abel friction continues right up to the present. Yet originally the term Cain came from the word Kain and symbolized evolution and experience. Well, this evolution was eventually destroyed by the house of spirit falling on him, as in the case of Samson. Now, the materialism our present technological society is the so-called mark of Cain. The third son of Adam was Seth. This came from the term Set, the original Egyptian god of materialism. And like Abraham, or Abram, the original word merely had an H added to it by the priests who altered the original stories. And then in the book of Enoch, it tells us Noah becoming the savior of the race during the deluge. And the deluge is to be caused by adultery between divine and mortal beings. The accepted scriptures then continue with the building of a 500-foot ark to save humanity. Well, we know better. Or at least we know better when we look at what these early ancient records and stories are trying to tell us. And when we see that the natural perfection of the earth was destroyed at the time of the gods interbreeding with our race. And then we can understand the adultery parable. We see that the mantle hanging over our perfection planet was lifted by a change in our atomic structure. And the altered atoms ascended into what we call the Van Allen radiation belt, and the alteration brought on a new cleansing action. And instead of being regenerated by pure solar radiation, our Earth was suddenly cut off from the full spectrum of the sun and had to be periodically rejuvenated by floods. Well, these floods washed the land masses with element-laden seawater and exposed new mineral-rich rock. And according to the Egyptian records, these cyclic floods occurred every 3,000 or 400 years or so. According to their scribes, the sun would stand still and then reverse herself as our poles shifted and the polar ice imbalance and buildup was corrected through cataclysmic surface changes in our planet. Well, the only survivors of these pole shifts, of course, were often saved because of boats and later wound up living in caves just like the cavemen till the weather settled down again. And this weather often was very out of proportion, hostile for 100 or 200 years. Now, there are at least 40 races that have traditions of their ancestors surviving these floods. Most of them were surviving through the use of small boats, rafts and such. And this is scattered all over the globe, these legends. And rather than being an actual physical account of the polar shift survivors of this area of the world, the Noah account is similar to a half a dozen earlier accounts of the chaos brought on by the exiled gods and their alteration of our perfection here. Now, the Egyptians used the term ark as a preserver of the sacred genes of humanity and the life forms on earth. And Pandora's box, as we noted, is a more vivid example of this same idea. Now, while there were survivors, ships that survived the floods, most of the Bible is referring to symbolism, the early legends and traditions, and a naked Noah symbolized a naked earth, and according to rabbinical lore went into partnership with Satan, growing crops for prophets. There are almost 400 accounts of this deluge and a similar Noah over the face of the earth. And this figures are contained in the legends and myths and accounts of other races, as we pointed out, all over the globe. And all of these controversial traditions keep alive the awesome original event where our Earth's perfection was suddenly disrupted by the entrance of this alien contamination, an alteration that brought on periodical physical disaster to life forms here. And in the Assurbanipal library at Nineveh, there are 3,000 lines of cuneiform script telling of the flood 700 years before the later version of Moses and the Hebrews came along. Now, in other presentations, we cover these periodical pole shifts or axis shifts, and we show proof of their occurrence and when the next one is coming and due. Now, later in our Bible, we have mention of the Tower of Babel, and this shows a period where magi and spiritual leaders from all parts of the world were brought to Babylon and taught the deeper truths that these gods of old felt that should be given out to humanity. And the observatory and other structures of Chichen Itza in Central America are close copies of the structures at Babylon during this period. And with such a diverse assemblage of travelers, the people of the time associated this with a Babel and tongues. Well, we can see that this confusion and chaos on the planet was brought here simply as another alien system that created chaos here, not as a purposeful intent of any Satan. Now, it's Satan's goal to bring about a paradise on earth, according to the records, but the intelligence level of humans must be slowly raised to a higher level, since most humans are more interested in sitting under banana trees in leisure than raising their intellect in some chaotic work situation. Because of this, the domination systems use force and chaos and strife on humanity to get them going, to uplift them mentally. You'll notice the dominion systems always encourage gain through mental action and manipulation. And persons who actually produce things are discouraged and kept under control. And the paper pushers and bankers and non-producers ensure humanity is even always under mental stress. And this, the domination fields, helps to increase the brain load and the wattage increase. Now, the Tower of Babel scenario is also an early symbolic Bible story of the system's priority here. the domination system. Well, as the Jewish priests borrowed from the earlier stories of other cultures, there was a blending of truth and fiction and symbolism, which is difficult to sort out in detail, yet very simple in principle. Well, many of the biblical characters are simply borrowed from earlier creation and causation accounts that still held the ancient knowledge and traditions intact. And even Jewish scholars admit this, up to the accounts of patriarchs like Abraham. Well, Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, which translated means he came from the place of demons, which was Chaldee. The Ur or Ur term is the same as the light of Lucifer, and Abram is driven from his Eden to become the racial father of the Jews. Well, also according to the old accounts, the scriptures, Melchizedek is the positive principle or personification of choice and good, greater in stature and purity than Abraham. Well, the little-known secret or fact here is that the Jews carry the DNA genetic patterns much heavier of the dominion systems, this alien intelligence that Satan so-called and the alien technological intelligences brought here. They carry it in a purer form than any other race. They even continue to keep this DNA lineage pure. In Zechariah 12:3 it says, "I will make Jerusalem a stone of burden for all of the people." Well, by manipulating and perpetuating the same old dominion gods and their dominion systems, it's easier for the manipulators of the world to hold the followers of the world in check and under mental control. And in view of who and what rules much of the world and the finances today, it should prove an incentive to change these baseless beliefs. Sinful Adam and murderous Cain and drunken Noah, thieving Jacob are hardly worthy of being examples to a moral religious foundation. Yet in their original forms, they were clear and easy to remember models for carrying over symbolism. The 12 sons of Jewish tradition, for example, parallel the 12 creators, the many myths of other cultures. Jacob's sons were born in Bethel, which meant house of cosmic energy, bread. Later we find a Savior born in Bethlehem. Here's Joseph. And in the accounts of Joseph and the bloodshed to follow, it's well to remember that the God spoken of is a non-moral genetic principle, oblivious to a literal right and wrong perspective. And with this God blessing, thievery and murder and slayings all follow, and a literal interpretation is rather foolish here. Well, much of Exodus in the Bible is symbolic, and the Israelites were in bondage to an extent, but nothing as severe as portrayed in the Bible. Bricks are building blocks like atoms, and mankind needs a leader like Moses to lead them into learning the mastery of matter. Well, the terms Moses and Amos and Amosis and Thutmose and other leaders are names that came from the term Mo, which was Egyptian for water. And Thutmose came from Thut, or born, and Mos, or Savior equaled, which of course meant Savior. A Savior is born. Well, all the pagan so-called cultures had similar saviors. And in the Orphic hymn to Bacchus, we find Mysis being picked up in a floating box and living a life in almost exact parallel to that of our Moses in the Bible. Well, in symbolism, Moses also appears to be earth. Even the archangel Michael disputed with the devil over who would get the body of Moses, or in this case, the earth. There's also some indication that a personage actually lived who was similar to Moses, and that this person was the son of a holy ghost, or windy one, which is the translation, and who was once stripped many of the earth gods of their superhuman powers, according to the traditions. Well, Moses was given the first commandments by an alien intelligence, or God, according to the records, and the first set of codes were filled with admonitions to do good to one another and all of the life forms in creation, according to some traditions. Well, after viewing his undisciplined followers, Moses evidently had a change of heart and decided such codes of affection would never hold his people together well enough. He broke up the first commandments then and went back to make up a harsher and more strict second set. And these were based on the tribal laws of his father-in-law, Jethro. Now, certain early Jewish manuscripts show these early origins, and many of the more detailed civil laws can be found in the Egyptian stele of Hammurabi, made up about 600 years early. And 6 of the 10 commandments can be found in the Egyptians' oath of clearance. The stele of Hammurabi, remember, was made up 600 years earlier. Now, this particular stele, or the Babylonian Code of Laws, was supposedly given to the king by one of the early gods of the planet. Jethro was eventually called on to help Moses set up the more complex tribal codes and laws. Jethro spread the burden around over various administrators and judges, and even today's law carries over much of the foundation laid by these early wise leaders, and especially Jethro. Well, there's much of Exodus that does appear to be factual in the Bible. It's woven in with the myths, the traditional education. There are records relating that the Hebrews invaded Palestine, or the land of Canaan, around 1400 BC. According to Egyptian records, Pharaoh Amenhotep got a number of urgent messages asking for help from the Egyptian rulers in Palestine. And the Egyptian escape from bondage is assumed by scholars to be somewhere around 1445 BC. And on a stele from a mortuary temple is one of the only other references to Israel. This stele tells of Israel's fall and desolation in 1200s BC. It confirms that the Israelites settled in Palestine in the 1300s BC. In symbolism, Moses is the creative power of earth, and his brother Aaron, the genetic consciousness of earth. Aaron, translated, means to conceive. And the serpent-like rod of Moses worked the same types of miracles as Apollo's arrows, if you remember. Well, the Red Sea that was parted has a similar meaning to the red earth that the fallen Adam had to struggle on to regain his perfection. In meeting the Lord who told him that I am that I am, the Jewish authors of the time were simply duplicating what was carved on the walls of most of the Egyptian and Hindu temples across the whole part of this area of the world. This should have been, though, I am what I will be, which the Jews shortened to Yahweh. Well, in recreating the many earlier creation stories, the Jewish priests and writers used the things around them in weaving new stories, and the plagues of Egypt were allegories about the formation of the ancient earth. Its hardening was linked to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart after each primeval epic of formation. While in truth, records of Egypt, which were kept accurately and continually, make no mention of the events which supposedly put the Egyptian kingdom in ruin. The Pharaoh's army of the time could in no way muster up the 600 horses which were said to have perished in the closing of the Red Sea. Well, several hundred years before Christ, the Jews no longer remembered that their writings were fabrications from earlier symbolic myths. They actually believed that these events occurred. And if you'll turn to the more ancient myths, you'll find Mount Olympus in Greece and Mount Meru in India are only 2 of a dozen high regions where the gods dwelt, according to many of these earlier records. The Egyptians probably had the most accurate account of creation, and our evolution was marked at the turning point by the term Sinai in Egypt, or in the Egyptian. Distorted, this was the Jewish Sinai Peninsula. According to one of the truly great historians of this world, which was Spengler, it was long after the exile period that the Jewish priests put together the concepts of the tablets of law coming from Mount Sinai and many other Old Testament stories. Well, in the ancient legends of the evolution of matter and man, there are usually temples and wealth, symbolizing the creative force of our Creator. And it was this meaning that the Hebrews' tabernacle and wealth referred to. The original band of refugees were virtually destitute, and there was no literal way they could have suddenly had all the wealth that it attributed to them. The temple and the gold would have cost over $2 million as it was put together in today's market of gold. For these wandering desert nomads to symbolically sacrifice thousands of blemish-free cattle and sheep is one thing. To literally do it is quite another, and it was well beyond any literal meaning. Well, in the account of Jericho, we find a rehash of building organic forms and energy from the destruction of matter. Researchers have found that the actual city of Jericho was so tiny that it could have been put in a present city block. Well, as in most of these mythical accounts, this battle of Jericho is only another hint that we humans must learn to control our passions. All material and earthly walls of matter can succumb to a joining of mental energies and self-control. Awesome power to move matter is available, and by giving up the usual chaotic domination patterns, the domination rulers, their cities of suppression and toil can be overthrown and rebuilt in beauty. Well, passing over Joshua and further accounts of humanity in the wilderness of uncontrolled emotions, we come to Judges and its mythology. If you think of it, you'll probably find that Samson is a rerun of Genesis. the planetary barren mother promised a son by an angel of the Lord would be reasonably accurate if the word son, S-O-N, were recognized as S-U-N. And out of the dead carcass of the Leo lion he slays comes the evolutionary life on Earth, or the beehive in symbology. Well, the term Delilah comes from Lila, meaning darkness, and the D meaning door, showing that she is like Eve, symbolize the purity of the spirit and first intelligence, being destroyed by matter. In earlier myths, the hair was the 7 strands, or 7 vibrational levels. As the sun, S-U-N, loses these, it's altered and captured as a material creation. And the same is true of the non-material gods who were banished here and became enmeshed and ensnared in matter. Is it beginning to make sense? Well, in many cases, it was some of these gods under the leadership of Satan who invented many of these myths to keep the truth alive through controversy. And only through controversy do truths survive on this planet. Well, many so-called Christians are completely closed-minded, of course, and they will not look at earlier records and see what existed and why. And Christians who research Samson are often surprised to find out that the Siamese had an exact duplicate of Samson, Samana, who saved them by pulling down the pillars of a temple on their enemies. And the later Greeks also had a Samson and Delilah legend, which came from the pre-Hebrew sources. Well, Belshazzar was made a king, the Jewish writers, and yet records of the period show he was only a regent for Nabonidus. And much of Daniel is written in Aramaic, which was not adopted by Jews until centuries after these incidents were supposed to have occurred. Over and over, the old mythical gods like Jacob, Joshua, Moses, and David demonstrate they are without principle and ethics, and yet the Jewish priests wrote down their exploits and lumped most of the lesser gods the title of one god, or Jehovah. These priests flattered their selfish, greedy, cruel gods to build up their own image and power. They didn't even correctly piece together the old myths and traditions they borrowed from. Well, in India, for example, is the Mahabharata, a book of poetry dating from around 500 BC, and it tells the original story of Sheba, which means the 7 planes of matter. The biblical book of Revelation also dwells on the 7 veils, or candlesticks, which we mentioned earlier. Well, the original stories of Samson and Samuel and Saul and Solomon all spring from earlier Egyptian and Indian stories having to do with the solar influences, or Sol, S-O-L, meaning sun, and Om representing the creative spirit. Egyptians were well aware of the creation and scenario and had very detailed representations for all of this creation, and in a second series we'll go into the exact details. Well, in this work we'll point out more discrepancies. For instance, Solomon's great temple has been found to be less than 125 feet long. As an archaeological structure, it would hardly take 7 years to build, unless the 7 years were symbolizing the 7 days of creation. Well, early illustrators exaggerated the proportions, as in this example. By way of contrast, we might consider Nagkon Wat in Cambodia, which is huge and has 100,000 carved figures showing what the earthly gods and subjects actually did in ancient times. Well, the archaeologists often tell the story. Solomon's Navy Yard was once excavated and was equally disappointing. His riches, the 666 talents, was a symbol of the planet. And Ophir is a derivative of Ophis, meaning Satan, the material ruler of the world. Well, in the Egyptian book called The Wisdom of Amenhotep of 1000 BC, we find the original story of Solomon, without all the later errors and fabrications. Most of the better historians also get the picture. According to the great historian Myers and Kingford, the Hebrews were rather backward and never contributed anything new at all to the culture of their time. They copied virtually all of their architecture, sciences, and writings from earlier cultures like Babylonia. And later we shall see where the original knowledges actually came from. Well, unfortunately, some of the modern fraternities are equally misled in their understanding of ancient Hebrew symbolism. They think that the temple referred to the human body, yet in truth it referred to the planetary bodies and the 7 planetary creative elements representing the pillars. Well, the Tower of Babel, whether it's one of the old ones or the new ones, are continually held up by the continual ignorance and intolerance and selfishness of humanity. And that's just the way it is. What we find is that the borrowed Hebrew mythology lost most of its original symbolic meaning after the 3rd century BC. It then was put to use as a dogmatic religion to retain followers. Well, in school we're taught that the ancients worshipped idols, and here's a group of so-called idols from Egypt and Greece, and of course, this is rubbish once you look into it, because each of these was a very well-designed symbol for what it represented. In the secret teachings of Jesus, we go into this somewhat further, especially in certain areas like the grasshopper, which you see at the right, which is the only insect that puts forth a spittle or a juice representing water from its mouth, and you can almost figure this out yourself. And each one of these had a significance. In many of the original myths, the 4 beasts or 4 spokes of the creative wheel were symbols of the evolving life principles, and they were later transferred to the creatures in the various Hebrew stories, like the animals in Ezekiel's vision. Now, the church used Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel originally. This was later turned into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by the priests. And Hitler's swastika, we might add, was an updated version of this old original creative principle symbol. Well, Jonah and Job were probably borrowed from Arabic and Babylonian traditions, and even the Jewish Talmud tells us that Job was an allegory. Job is the child of divinity, if you remember, and is stripped of all he possesses. And later he regains his faith. And this is a nice tale to tell ignorant humans who want persons of authority to follow, to have faith in them. A couple of thousand years of chaos and bloodshed have shown us the fruits of this path. Like the Old Testament, the New Testament has its basic foundation theme. Jesus, the man, falls like Adam into the bonds of matter and is locked into pain and temptation until his Christ nature leads him to perfection and immortality through self-control and self-knowledge. St. Augustine, the founder of Christian theology, observed that Christianity originally sprang from the knowledge held by the ancients, and virtually all of the Bible was simply a reweaving of the older knowledges and traditions. The occult cosmology, which preceded and led to Luke, Mark, and Matthew, was very ancient and later destroyed and twisted, according to very early historians like Eusebius. Many of the present historians feel that the New Testament was written by Gnostic Jews who tried to present Christ as an ideal and moral figurehead for their race. Well, ironically, they later rejected the literal figure of this Savior and today deny the very personage their forefathers created. Now, this isn't to imply there was no Jesus. There's no doubt that several spiritual teachers existed during the period that would have fitted into the natural mold for the Jesus that was written about. There are several scattered documents that indicate one Jesus got his training at a Gnostic monastery near the Dead Sea. Oh, the very early Christians who were aware that most Christian teachings sprang from earlier and more symbolic writings were repudiated and persecuted by the 2nd century. One great spiritual teacher of the time, known as Vikata in India, spent time in Egypt, Tibet, and India before returning to his homeland around Palestine. And one thing is for certain, whomever the Romans accepted as the Jesus of the Bible was a very special person. The hard-bitten, realistic Romans changed their calendar in his honor, and they were not easy people to impress. Well, Jesus and his teachings were quickly distorted by everyone from Paul to priests of the later church. And Jesus, for example, said he went to show a way unto eternal life, not that he died to save anybody. He pointed out that most men hear only with a physical ear, and the others closed off from hearing the indwelling soul's spiritual knowledge. And to make the low things high and the crooked things straight, as he put it, he knew that we must tap this inner soul knowledge and follow its higher ethics. And he pointed out that the original male and female soul split only on falling into this material world. And the kingdom of heaven was within, he said repeatedly. And people who learn to totally relax their various inner components can know joy in a heaven on earth. A heaven on earth, as he pointed out in his Lord's Prayer. Now, there are some traditions telling of secret names and such that Jesus used when teaching his inner disciples. And such a name was Abramentho. It was used by this inner group in casting out demons. But it wasn't any secret words or names he used, however. It was simply that he tapped into his higher knowledge and directed his thoughts very clearly. And this we cover in other presentations. Now, in casting out other dimensional spirits, Jesus was said to use the words of power by the mystery schools even today. And these words are supposedly known by other dimensionals. Well, in actuality, any strong thoughts from persons following free choice laws were effective in such work if used with correct concentration. And why it's necessary to become balanced and cut off certain mind components to tap this spiritual soul knowledge is also a subject that's too long to cover here and covered elsewhere. Well, in the recent Nag Hammadi, or Dead Sea Scrolls, there are a number of new writings attributed to Christ, and along with the Apocalypse, give a little deeper insights into the general views of Christ. With a couple of million manuscripts destroyed in Alexandria alone, there's reason to believe that there was a great deal of material around at one time for the Hebrews to borrow from and expand on. The only reasonably accepted source of a historical Jesus is in the Jewish Antiquities book of Josephus. And unfortunately, many historians feel that the comments here on Christ were added later by Christians. Plutarch and Pliny and Tacitus and Epictetus and Porphyry and other philosophers and historians around shortly after Christ knew nothing about his existence, only the existence of the Christ or Christian sects. Well, in fact, the narration of many events in the life of Jesus were woven from the early books of mythology. Yet there were living examples of the period who gave out enough teachings to reinforce the foundation principles and make them valid. Many of these early teachers of that period, these spiritual teachers, were knowledgeable of spiritual law and helped transform the world of this era. Christianity, with all of its backwardness and ignorance, slowly moved our species forward in law and ethics. And even today, much of our present laws can be traced back to the Hebrews, as we mentioned before. Well, the virgin birth of a Savior is a tale popular in all ancient cultures. And in South America, it was the mother of Quetzalcoatl. Zoroaster's is a term for a son of the stars. Bodhisat announced Buddha. Maya had Agni. Marha had Bacchus. Mariamma had Krishna. And, of course, we had Samson, Samuel, and Jesus of the Hebrews. And all of these events signified the spiritual energy and space ready to produce a sun, S-U-N, or matter. And it was the sons in person, like Jesus, who pointed out that we can become creators if we learn ethics and concentration. Well, today's learned theologians and experts on Bible history often never go beyond the Hebrew era to find the truth. They shun and have contempt for the immoral gods of Greece or more ancient times, but actually follow the same myths themselves, only cloaked in different garments. Well, as we keep pointing out, in the most ancient and hidden traditions, there were once gods on earth. And from their mating, there often came world saviors who taught the rest of humanity the deeper knowledges. Babylon, for example, had Ishtar, the mother of their race. And in Sumeria, she was called Mama, the term we still use. And in Greece, the goddess Aphrodite and Hermes were creators of the new species. Well, in Egypt, the first goddess was Mut. Later, the soul of Mut came back as Isis, the mate of Horus, the prototype of Jesus. Immaculate Isis, the records state. Well, there are some Egyptian records that state that the first gods could rejuvenate their bodies until their powers were taken from them. And historians read such records and scoff. Yet science is on the verge of just such discoveries themselves today. And since we know that cells can rejuvenate themselves, it's only a matter of finding the aging chemical in the human system, blocking it or eliminating it. And we humans can then rejuvenate ourselves just like the gods did. Well, A.B. Glazier, the founder of the modern human comprehension courses, gave out just such keys in his writings. Took a very special balance of mind components to shut off the aging hormones and raise the wattage of the system high enough, however, and very few people could master that technical and mental balance. Well, in the human genetic bank, there's a knowledge of this early period when knowledge has arrived and upset the peace and tranquility of our planet. And it's our inner DNA tapes that carry over such awareness and give us a desire to accept and venerate the gods and saviors of our time. People are still demanding popes and kings and governments and gods. They carry over this propensity from the ancient times. Well, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph have replaced the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost to many worshipers, and according to the Bible in Matthew, the child produced by Mary was Emmanuel. And Emmanuel, in its original form, meant God is with us. The original Hebrew word for virgin was Alma, which meant young woman. Well, original works tell of Christ and a dozen other saviors being born in a cave in the wilderness, and many later countries portray the nativity scene taking place in a cave. And according to many ancient texts, the Magi who attended after Christ's birth were also present at the birth of Confucius and Krishna and Osiris and other mythological personages. And when Isis was fleeing with the divine Horus, he was the earliest counterpart of Mary fleeing with Joseph to Egypt. And the story of Joseph can be recognized as a counterpart of similar Egyptian traditions. Well, the Bible is full of baptisms. And the origin is originally from the fact that the human needed release from mind control of these ancient gods. Water grounded out the over-control or brainwashing. And the gods of India, Greece, and Egypt were all baptized and symbolically left with their own original knowledge intact. And today, we're still being hypnotized by the ancient knowledges that are not our own. Now, virtually all ancient cultures referred to the 12 creative forces of the gods, or Osiris and Marduk had their 12 helpers, and so did the authors of the Gospels. Paul in his epistles knew nothing of the 12 followers of Jesus, and the only mention of it was later church interpretations. But there was a personage who did teach in this part of the world during this period, and he was flesh and blood in reality, and even the Romans were impressed. Because according to the records still held in various monasteries, there was an individual teaching and teacher who helped in understanding the spiritual scriptures of the world and studied with them and understood and taught these deep spiritual significant truths. And he taught that a pure spirit and ethics were far more important than material gains and money. Yet today, the majority of persons who profess to follow this person prefer to worship him rather than follow his teachings. They spend most of their lives in the marketplace, chasing money and remaining materialistic. Well, as we pointed out before, according to the Egyptian mythology, thousands of years before Christ, Horus went to Beth Anu to raise his father. And the sisters were Mary and Myrte, and their brother was El-Azar-Us. Beth Anu meant house of God. And in India, Krishna raises a young girl from the dead and performs a number of actions which were duplicated in the later biblical stories and fabrications. Well, in the original crucifixion symbology, Osiris was mourned by Mary and Myrte. Babylonian versions had Ishtar crucified, buried, and mourned. And in all, there were 16 saviors of various countries who were hung on a cross and died. Even our Mexican neighbors below us have traditions of Quetzalcoatl dying on a cross. Well, what all this originally symbolized was the entrapment of the other dimensional spirit forms of the gods in the material world of this planet, the material, exotic, material atoms, trapped. And the oldest records in existence sometimes show this crucifixion as nature wrapping her material mantle around the exiled and alien gods here. And as they became caught in the material world in its birth and death cycles, it was they who perpetuated these controversial stories, and they knew that only through this controversy would these stories continue on, and that the hidden meanings would be recognized later and trigger recall in those with appropriate backgrounds. And the original knowledge, which came from the exiled gods, or originators of knowledge here on earth, there were exacting details of the body functions. And these beings knew of the 7 veils that had to be parted for them to regain their eternal life here. And this procedure necessitated a balance of a number of mind and body components. And this procedure is outlined in the Modern Human text series. Well, to ensure that the principles were carried over, much of it wound up in the symbolism of the book of Revelation. The stars of heaven and Lucifer the dragon and the various other gods that fell from heaven were those identities of intelligence that were banished here originally in non-material forms. The banished 144,000 are described in earlier Hindu traditions of almost 8,000 years ago. And other records like this Sumerian stele continue the story. And in the last part of Revelation, the domination systems tell the exiled gods were put in place here. And they point out the future possibilities on this planet. Well, if humanity, for example, continues in its materialistic pursuits and goals, there's a chance that we shall see some of Revelation fulfilled. If enough persons go back to choice systems and the golden rule ethics, however, we won't. It's as simple as that. And as we keep pointing out, the spiritual teachers all taught that we could have a paradise on earth, as it is in heaven, and that we could gain eternal life here. And they pointed out that only by granting choice and following the free choice laws, the golden rules, so to speak, could we graduate to higher levels. And by self-control and action, they said we could use mind over matter eventually, as they did. Well, unfortunately, the priests who followed all these great teachers founded religions on them and twisted their teachings around. And as long as men put money in the priests' donation plates, they can teach their followers that there will someday be a better life if only they will believe. Well, belief has killed millions of persons and was not condoned by Christ or other leaders, spiritual leaders. They taught that we should know ourselves and act in knowledge, not belief. Well, by their fruits ye shall know them, the Bible points out. Yet if we go back 700 years and run through the history of Christianity, it's one of the most unsuccessful of all beliefs and systems in bringing about a better world here. There are over 3 million humans died in the futile Christian crusades, and 10 million died during the Inquisition period, and 14 million were slain in Christian wars of the 19th century, and another 30 million were slain in recent Christian ethics war of this 20th century of ours. Well, up to the 19th century, the violence and moral decadence among Christians and Christian nations was disgusting most of the time, to say the least. In the vast knowledge of the early exiles to Earth, there was an understanding of how our material universe worked. They didn't have complex theories. They knew. Satan and his followers, so to speak, were some of the most intelligent identities in the universe. And when they got trapped in matter here, they made sure that at least some of this knowledge was carried over and preserved. And since the Atlantean civilization was the most advanced on Earth at their arrival, they made this their headquarters for the most part until it sank. Ancient Greek and Egyptian records show that Asia Minor and Greece and Turkey and Terrania were settled before Egypt, and eventually Egypt was settled when one of the lesser gods, Thoth, left his angry leader, King Kronos, in Atlantis. Well, the Egyptians began careful records of all events from the earliest time. Such as Suchus, the Egyptian historian, told the Greek historian Solon that his people were naive concerning history. And he told him that there had been several floods, and they were only a childlike remnant of the original race from the motherland. And this was from Jewet's Critias Translated. Well, much of the Bible is made up of tales which were duplications of earlier stories designed to preserve the ancient knowledges of creation. An open-minded person can easily find such truths in many, many writings all over the world, from the great temples to the steles to papyruses. Sumeria has been thought by historians to be the birthplace of humanity, but the very legends of the Sumerians themselves tell of their civilization and knowledge as being brought from a land across the sea. Virtually all of the civilized people of the world have legends of these visitors coming to teach them the arts of culture. And historians, of course, like to scoff at most traditions like this, but time after time the ancient stories and documents have turned out to be true. An example is the Iliad of Homer. It was fantasy until the topless towers of Ilium were exposed, and Minos was a myth until Knossos was excavated by and covered there in Crete. Well, the gods did know what they were doing, and the original translations of chapter 6 and 5 and 1 and 2 of Genesis should have stated the sons of gods mated with earth women. And in the New English Bible translation, the correct God to gods is made. Well, the original languages of the exiles were carried over as what we loosely know as the High German language today. This is a scientific language that differs from ordinary German, and it's still used by scientists and professionals in Germany. It was carried over from much ancient, more ancient origins. And Hebrew, and the many other languages which came into use after the Tower of Babel scenario, are quite different and mixed, and were given by various leaders and gods of the time under their kingdoms. And this dissension between the gods is quite well known and quite well depicted in the ancient cultures. And Hesiod's Theogony describes the dissension and the destruction of their first empires and how survivors spread over the rest of the planet with their different languages. And as we mentioned earlier, Tower of Babel was kind of a rerun of this early problem, when many of the persons coming from the various parts of the planet had problems in understanding each other. The Great Babel. At one time, the Book of Enoch was in both the Christian and the Jewish Bibles, and because much of the rest of the Bibles were taken from it, and the fact that it refuted some of the church's doctrines, it was eventually taken out of the later collections. And Enoch is considered far older than the Mosaic account of Genesis. And it describes how the sons of gods mated with the daughters of men and later taught our races the pleasures and sins of culture. And Enoch tells of the flood, and like 40 other survivor accounts that I have in my collection, escaped like Noah in our Bible. Well, according to other visionaries, like the seer who we refer to as Jesus, at the end time the sun shall be darkened, and amid the chaos the elect shall be gathered together. And this seems to coincide with the next flood or pole shift that Egyptian records show will be upon us in about 2004. And as weather worsens, it portends another cycle of disaster for persons who cannot follow their spiritual leaders' advice and tap their own inner awareness. At this point, it should be clear that most of the narrations in our Bible which seem a little too allegorical or ridiculous are allegorical. Many have stemmed from earlier allegories or stories that were deliberately designed by their inventors to be controversial enough to continue down through the ages. In the Indian Vedas and Upanishads, this allegory is a little simpler. We find the body represented by the chariot, and the charioteer and reins as the intellect and the minds. The unbalanced and uncontrolled horses are equal to our uncontrolled minds. In our King James Bible, the symbolism keys are a little more complex, but almost as simple. The term ether, for example, or atmosphere, is carried over from the non-matter state of the gods, or Atman, as it was termed in Indian records. Ether has a completely different meaning than air, or clouds in the air. Air generally showed the clear thoughts coming through from the body's different mind components. If there were clouds to get in the way, this blocks the clear perception. Well, angels often came out of the obscuring cloud formations, indicating our potentials when we clear away our blocks to clear perception. Animals, which are predatory, have long been used to show our gaining mastery over our base domination desires. And the symbol of the sheep, of course, is the same now as it was earlier. Now, it's upon the altars or the higher self and body that we can sacrifice our sheep, like weaknesses or other animalistic desires. The molten gold calf indicated a subservience to materialism and show. The battles are usually indicating a conflict between the principles of domination and baser actions and the free choice and ethical nature of humans. Birds originally indicated the higher minds, and in Egypt, the popular three-bird glyph showed 3 human minds. The men with bird heads showing a balancing of the brain and minds. Doves often indicated advanced wisdom in the Bible. The dove sellers, or persons who used their knowledge for commercial ends, were driven out of the temple by Jesus. Well, peacocks usually indicated a prideful, showy condition that could block advancement. Fish have often indicated sublimated passions. And the water represents emotions, and fish have shown several sublimations of these emotions. Marriages usually showed a union between the non-physical soul or brain with the mind-oriented self. At one with, or atonement, was later turned into atonement by Christians. And nativities referred to the opening of new cycles or phases. The nativity of Jesus paved the way for persons to overcome the limitations of death and matter. By around the year 2000, this cycle will be over. We'll either have our paradise, or we will have destroyed ourselves and flunked a training of this cycle. If we fail, we'll go into a period of darkness and night, because night or blindness has always had a very clear meaning. Pillars of fire and such simply show a flow from the creative force or soul. Moses, you remember, was guided by such a pillar of fire, and that the bird at the head of this particular pillar indicates that the intuitional or creative knowledge came from the higher soul source. The Egyptians had a symbol for all the human mind, body, and creative force components. And today our learned scholars and Bible historians seem to ignore such clear origins. The veils represent a mental block, and each of the 7 veils must be lifted by balancing the mind and brain action before the higher marriage state can occur. Well, A.B. Glazier's Modern Human Comprehension texts have illustrations showing how these 7 veils may be passed for a transformation and working so-called miracles. After about a fifth of our lives spent in some state-sanctioned school program, it's often very difficult for many persons to think for themselves and discover the truth that's all around us. The dominion or domination systems in power on earth are kept alive by ignorance and dissension Most persons really don't want the responsibility of finding their own answers and being self-sufficient physically and mentally. In the past, education was usually different than today. Now, if the state offers to take responsibility, fine. We can send off our children to get a state education. No problem. We often realize that there are shortcomings to this, but this is the easy way. Let's not rock the boat. We may get punished. Well, in the past, this kind of thinking usually brought on subjugation in the end. And if the state or a leader tells us a lie supported by so-called experts or Holy Scripture, we fall right in line and accept it as the gospel. And today's chaos has changed little from the chaos of yesterday's centuries, and the heads of today's Christians are still accepting the dogmas of priests who had no virtually understanding at all of the biblical allegories. And they usually insist on unquestioning obedience and acceptance of literal meanings, with the same type of punishment and damnation threats. Well, by now we should be getting a little of the true picture in this area. Well, we humans really don't need to be sheep, and after a desire for the truths, we can next put in a little mental order or prayer for more of our inner knowledge, the know thyself knowledge that Jesus and other biblical carriers constantly spoke of. And why hasn't this knowledge been brought out before? Well, it has. Truth has always been available to persons willing to track it down. Well, the problem has always been that truth has never been popular, and the dominion systems lose control when truth prevails, and for thousands of years now, there have been mystery schools and secret fraternities and orders who have taught many of these hidden meanings of the Scriptures. In the time of Jesus, there were a number of sanctuaries that still held the truth. The Book of Enoch, for example, was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. And there are at least a dozen phrases used by Christ in the Bible that are almost identical to phrases in the earlier Book of Enoch that was available at that time. Jesus told the temple priests that he did not come to destroy the law and prophets' work. And over he spoke of the wicked, which in Enoch meant the fallen angels of the rebellion or watchers that we spoke of before. Well, the Book of Enoch gives far more detail on the issues of the exiles. It tells that these watchers will be bound to earth and act as evil spirits, corrupting and oppressing mankind. It says that they will fight among themselves till the number of corpses is beyond count. And it's full of the aspects of judgment on the watchers and their dominion system. And the New Testament is filled with passages that allude to this end-time judgment of the watchers and their offsprings. And it's felt that much of the New Testament came from Enoch. We also know that many of the theologians, historians, and church fathers around shortly after Christ were aware of Enoch because they mention the fact. The writers Justin and Lactantius, Tatian, Tertullian, and many other church fathers relied on the Enoch texts until the church had a change of heart and censored them and burned all the Enoch manuscripts that they could locate. Well, it's probably little wonder, because what Enoch tells us in a nutshell is that the exiles will corrupt the planet until the final judgment. They'll continually shed blood in their wars and have no remorse or peace of mind. And with their other dimensional giants aiding them, they can feed on the work and energy of those who they suck into their systems, according to Enoch. And as we watch the corrupt, chaotic world around us, it should be quite clear that these early texts saw pretty clearly into the truth, and things have changed very little in the last 10,000 years. And the wealth and the food of the world is still in the hands of cunning master manipulators, and it seems that only the garments and faces have changed much. And who are these manipulators today? According to a number of researchers, the original exiles were placed on all of the continents and promptly put the Homo sapiens species to work building the pyramids and temples that we see around the earth today. And today, they're the persons who carry over the same souls or DNA components. Well, according to the ancient records, the exile leaders found our species unable to understand technology or hold higher level knowledge in our limited brain pan. So they decided on a long-range plan to improve our species. They set up dominion systems that would force us into constant striving and mental advancement. They set up monetary systems that ensured they would always remain in control. And at this point in time, they feel that they're about ready to become free of Earth and soon colonize other planets and contaminate them with our system here. And since their non-material soul carries over much of its superior knowledge of finances and technology, they don't find being born in a new body that great a hindrance to gaining wealth and power again. They have very little compunction about using people, and without the usual ethics, they can totally use, manipulate, and abuse the average person on this planet. As we come into the last days of the present cycle, the beings who carry the exile components see their systems slowly self-destructing, just as in the past. And this has caused them to push the space program in all haste, hoping that by the time the total chaos comes, they'll be off this planet or deep within underground survival complexes. Well, in the Bible it tells of this. It says that in Micah 7:17, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, and I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. Yet shalt thou be brought down unto hell." And they'll probably even be forced from their underground fortifications. Micah 7:17. Read it. What actually seemed to happen when the watchers of Enoch, or the exiles of the war in heaven, were put here was that they were carefully monitored and watched. The wardens or parole officers of our planet use the same craft that once took Enoch and Ezekiel for a ride. For reasons that are obvious, this is a hard concept to accept for rational, school-educated humans. Well, many of these different alien craft closely monitor all of our major space shots and war moves and even genetic research. They constantly test animals to see that we don't go too far in corrupting and confounding the original genetic species here. Well, the mating of the gods with the daughters of men apparently created enough chaos, and it simply won't be allowed to happen to other species on this planet. And this alien monitoring and animal mutilation has been occurring ever since our governments encouraged genetic experiments. The examples of alien craft abducting animals and humans for genetic study is covered up, and it's covered in other presentations of ours. As we come to these latter days, the close of these latter days, the book of Revelation will either become a reality or it can be overridden by the choice and free will of humanity. Freedom has always come only to organized people who worked together to get freedom and to keep it. The civilized people of the world are once again giving up their freedoms, though, for government leaders who take some of their responsibilities away. And the few persons able to escape the coming chaos must learn to use their higher level components in the same way that Jesus and others did. You might recall that in the Bible, Jesus literally disappeared before one angry crowd outside Jerusalem. Well, how a human being learns to work these so-called miracles is a subject covered in A.B. Glazier's Modern Human Texts, which came out in the mid-70s, and they showed that the three human minds all generated electrical current. And if the normal wattage of 5 to 7 watts of energy a day could be tripled, the human could perform awesome feats of matter manipulation mentally. And there have been some of the Eastern mystics and miracle workers, so-called, who were put on EKG machines. And they proved that this could be done. Glazier showed how it could be done without years of training. So what do the Bibles say about the future? Well, since time only exists on this physical plane, persons who can send their non-material or non-material components into the other dimensions can often get a time-free view of the future. And these persons have usually been called prophets if they were on the right side of the religions or regimes in power. And if they were not, they were often destroyed as witches and such. So our Bible has a number of prophetic sections mixed in with symbolism and history. And the events of our time are mentioned repeatedly, and our American nation is pinpointed very often as a land of the eagle. The eagle being the symbol of the God of the true Israel. Exodus 19, Deuteronomy 32, Isaiah 40, Jeremiah 48 and 49, Revelation 12 mention the eagle. And Ezekiel 38 and 39 mentions Magog, which in Greek meant anti-Christian party. And the Hebrew word originally translated guard. It meant prison. So Magog, the communist empire, has imprisoned a vast part of the world. It's to eventually attack Israel or United States and North American people. And this is a map showing concentration camps and psychiatric prisons in Russia today. The Bible points to North Americans being the true Israel in a number of places. One, by mentioning the mountains of Israel, which has always been laid and been waste. and where the people dwelt safely in this land, unlike completely the Palestine area. It says that we're an unwalled nation without bars or gates, in the land of cattle and goods. And this does not typify Palestine at all. And we have been an unwalled nation with unwalled villages since the beginning. According to the 39th chapter of Ezekiel, the communists, or Gog, will attack North America, being Israel, but natural catastrophes will decimate their huge armies. And it'll take 7 months just to mop up their destroyed armies in this situation. And why will this take place? Well, over and over the prophets point out that we North Americans will turn from the laws of the Creator and will be punished for our short-sighted actions. Now, the laws of the one Creator are simple. If we break the golden rule and the laws of granting choice to others, we as individuals or as a nation will get a taste of our own medicine. And eventually, the U.S. will survive and be spared because we're one of the most generous, free choice following natures and nations. So will we change in time to offset this prophecy? Well, as a majority, we've failed to be responsible for ourselves and allowed our nation and Constitution to become weakened and eroded, as we said before. And as a people, we'll be punished automatically. And the philosophers and spiritual teachers have sometimes called such laws karma, or the laws of retribution. And even today, you can see a person or a nation get just what they brought on themselves by breaking choice laws and using excessive domination. The Russians generally have never embraced free choice, and they've always been destroyed. And communism is obviously going to self-destruct eventually, as the biblical prophets saw. Now, the way the karmic laws of reward looked at the time of the prophets, the North Americans would eventually regain their prosperity. But the tide could be turned either way, and a coming polar shift could destroy virtually all of our present civilizations. Now, persons who are interested in the Israel interpretations can go elsewhere. We do not have time here. There are many alert religious writers who have works out on this subject. And what does the Bible say about who are the nations from the time of Noah? Well, Gomer is England. Magog, as we pointed out, is generally the communist nations today, China. And Medea is Medes. Havan was the Greeks. And Tubal, Russia. Meshech is Russia. Tyrus is the Thessians. Mizraim in the Bible is Egypt. And Phut is Libya. And Canaan is the Canaanites. The tribe of Elam is the Elamites. And Ashur is the Assyrians. Aphrodite had the Chaldeans, and Lud is the Syrians. Aram is the Syrians also. Well, if you're serious about biblical study, you'll want to know about the numbers. The meaning of numbers in the Bible follows in the tradition of much earlier symbology. The early gods were well aware of how creation occurred and matter was put together, and they carefully chose numbers to relate to such events, and this went beyond the single concept of quantity. One usually signified a manifestation between the Creator and the material world, a pillar in one sense, and it showed a singular ego. Symbol 2 showed the negative and positive principle on our carbon-based material planet. And the symbol 3 generally pointed to the growth of 2, mated and giving birth, and the third non-material factor relating to the 2. 4 often indicated a 3 gaining the technological intelligence base and going on into logic, discrimination, and mind reason. 5 shows the benefits and rewards and punishments coming through the use or misuse of the prior qualities or numbers. And 6 represents the harmony coming from cooperation between the higher minds and abilities. Well, 7 indicates the earlier lessons learned and the possible mastery of matter if the earlier lessons are learned. And as this mastery is achieved, there can be an in and out regeneration or an 8. Now, this 8 is a rhythm that can eradicate or end an entrapment in matter and systems in general. 9 is the symbol of regeneration, or extending out again with knowledge of the eternal laws. The number 10 symbolizes the marriage of the world of matter and spirit, or a blending for perfection. And 10 contains the 0, which stands for infinity and the original factor in all things. Now, the whole universe is made up of rings of energy, and the world we live in is made up of such rings of energy touching together to perform and form matter. Now, at this point, I should point out that there's a widespread confusion on Earth as to just what constitutes good and evil. Much of the symbolism that you've learned of here has been given out before by mystery schools and secret orders since the dawn of history, or the advent of what we can call the exile contamination. The thing that has never been taught is the fact that there are generally the real and counterfeit mixed together in all of the writings and teachings and symbolism. The term real is a term for the original uncontaminated knowledge of self, or the one creator, the reflection being a term for the exile's counterfeit knowledge, using domination as a base. Learning to differentiate between real and counterfeit is tricky, but it's very simple. Just listen. Writers or teachers give themselves away by mentioning domination terms. A dominion or domination terms are usually meant to build up fear in a person unless they adjust to the domination system. And examples are, you must do this or follow us to gain that. Typically to go to heaven or someplace, or whatever. Now, the reflection system has a lofty goal of desiring a paradise on earth, but it's a paradise run with rules, regulations, and leaders. Virtually all of the cults and religions today, as they're set up, usually have a leader. Someone who is going to take the responsibility off the backs of the congregation. And this is domination. And anyone working under this is under a domination system. Now ask yourself, if you belong to a group, who must you follow? If you follow any individual besides yourself and your own knowledge, then you are under a dominion system. Because a free choice system will never tell an individual they must do anything. And the free choice system is from the Creator. And the Creator never tells us we must do anything. The gods of the Bible were gods of this earth, and we know who the prince of this earth is. Persons can either comprehend that the golden rule and self-control is the only workable system under the Creator's law, or they must go back into more cycles to learn such a lesson the hard way, firsthand. Well, at this point, you'll either get indignant and have all kinds of negative mind-oriented thoughts pouring into your head, or you'll begin to see the hidden truth that we've been pointing out here. As far as understanding the symbology we've covered, let's see if you can interpret what the story of Jonah was about. Jonah, you recall, was 3 days and nights in the belly of the whale. And the ship referred to the body, and the sea, the emotions, and the fish, the sublimated passions, all of which showed that the human was learning to control himself by balancing his components in mental nature. Wasn't that simple? And in the future, remember to recognize the systems that would dominate and control your thinking, to fill in details. It'd be nice to hear from you and to send you details on further presentations in this area. This is Al Fry. So long, and it's been nice. Watch yourself. Because you have all the knowledge required to free yourself within yourself. Remember that.